Welcome to Season 5, Episode 28 of the Be Conscious podcast. Today I am joined by Steve Ricks, the author of Play Saves the Day, Discover Your Playful Self, who joins us from Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Steve tell us about reimagining play in our often serious and stressful adult lives, and what he is doing to change the world for the better. Here we go.
Welcome to the Be Conscious podcast, the show that brings you enlightened perspectives on the frequency of money, life's many challenges, and those heavy feelings that may be holding you back from living your best life. And now your host, Dr. Susan Nicholas.
Steve has 30 years of experience in human development, from public companies to private entities, and from startups to Fortune 100 companies. He has a vast array of exposure to how people perform in the workplace. His playful nature led him on that roller coaster ride we call entrepreneurship, until he planted his stake in the ground and found the company Play Lab. Steve, welcome to the Be Conscious podcast.
Aloha, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here with you. What a great intro. Super excited. Love that music. Gets me pumped up and has me very conscious right now. I'm excited to be with you.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Steve, we have a common friend, and I know a little bit about your story, but on the Be Conscious podcast, we really like to get to the root of what motivates us as human beings to do what we are doing, like the good that we're doing in the world. And so can you help me and help our audience to understand who is Steve Ricks? How did you grow up? And what was it about your work environment or your work life that led you into doing what you're doing now?
Great question. Happy to give some insight to your listeners. I grew up in the East Coast, so a long way from home over here in Honolulu, Hawaii. I grew up in New England, and I very early in my life was exposed to the struggle of dysfunctional family and a lot of the challenges that come with that. And I grew up in the inner city of Boston, or kind of the outskirts of the inner city, I guess, to be accurate, but within 30 minutes, stone throw of Boston, and in a really rough kind of neighborhood. And I'll never forget as a child, really adolescence. I think I was 12 years old. I actually was witness to finding a fellow schoolmate behind the gymnasium with a bullet hole in his head. And that moment, Susan, shaped the rest of my life because it occurred to me that that's just not the way you're supposed to find a young boy. And I didn't know how, and I didn't know when or where, but I knew I wanted my life to amount to something to support those kinds of things not happening anymore. And I went off to college, worked in community service, then worked in an element of the church world. And then from there, I stepped into the world of entrepreneurialism. But over the last 30 years, I like to tell people I don't really think that I chose my path. I think my path chose me because everywhere I've gone, the constant theme in the element of my work that I've gravitated to, whether, as you mentioned in the intro, public, private, startup, Fortune 100, wherever I found myself, the the thing I gravitated most was just in corporate nomenclature was human capital. I love people. And so, kind of what's led me to today is my own journey of emotional roller coaster, my own challenges with finding really a life full of peace and joy and happiness. And I began to ask a question probably about 10 years ago, which was, why are so many people in the world so unhappy? And including myself. having had many moments of happiness, but feeling like it was more a roller coaster than an upward trajectory. And that's kind of led me to where I'm at today with my passion for play and mental well being.
Steve, firstly, I wanted to go back to that 12-year-old Steve.
Yeah.
Can you remember the last time that you played? Like, was that a pivotal moment in that there's this, I believe, for us as human beings, particularly in Western cultures, maybe around the world, where there's a, a shift that occurs between childhood and adulthood. And what you experienced as a 12-year-old boy, I wonder if that shift came earlier for you, where perhaps that marked the time where it wasn't about playing anymore, your imagination. It
Mm.
was maybe there was fear or other types of things that are
Yeah,
involved.
that
Did you play the same after that,
no,
I
it's
guess?
interesting. I would say from that period till about when I was 15, so a 3-year period, it became very, very clear to me that that life was about to get different for a couple reasons. One, as a child, as I mentioned, in a dysfunctional single parent home, and one of those parents emotionally unstable, the other parent unavailable, and between the challenges associated with that, I think by 15, I realized I was alone. Now, that may not have been true. However, that was the narrative over that 3-year period that I built for myself, so much so that I worked 2 to 3 jobs to get myself out of my environment and into an actual boarding school. And as I reflect back on that, it's interesting you asked me that. I felt like I had to grow up early, that I had to begin to think about how to
Mhm.
get past the circumstances that frankly made me very uncomfortable. So, yeah, 12, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, no
Yeah.
one's ever asked me that way. That's a great question. And I think it's probably true for a lot of human beings that our journey requires us to abandon play long before yeah,
Very
very early,
early.
long before we should. And the truth is, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this as we go, but today I think the biggest way back to mental health is changing the narrative that like we should never abandon play. It should be part of healthy living, whether I'm 8 or 80. And we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. But great question.
Mhm. Steve, when in my life, I should say, and experiences along my conscious journey, your book had me thinking about myself and playing. And a couple things came up. One was almost in religion, like a religious belief that, when we go into adulthood, we lay down childish
Yes.
things. And then like you become an adult, like it's the expectation is whatever definition you had of play or the definition that we kind of default to with play, that you don't get to do that anymore. You got to grow up and take responsibility and be
Yeah.
mature.
Did you ever
And
get
so I
asked
think,
or told to
go ahead.
act your age and not your shoe size? Yeah, that
Yes,
that very much
exactly.
I appreciate what you allude to in religion because of that. But please go on.
I had a conversation with an old friend. I was probably, I would say, in my early 40s. I had my son, I had a young child, about a 4-year-old, and I reconnected, I think on Facebook or on some, social media app with a friend that I had not seen since we were children, since elementary school. Her family moved away, and she said something to me that had me thinking about my life. She said, "I remember you used to laugh all the time, and I loved your laugh." And my response to her was, "I haven't laughed like that in a very long time." And I think each of us loses that childhood playfulness at different ages for different reasons. Some people never lose it. You do see that 80-year-old that's just smiles from ear to ear and everything's fun and play. But for, I think, the lion's share of us, there's something that happens, like there's a pivotal moment where we're not, I would say, allowed to be children anymore. And that's before biologically, if you will, we become adults. I'm trying to think about when that happened for me. And I didn't experience the trauma that you experienced with death very early on, not in the physical sense, but I wonder if I experienced like a little bit of death of the soul very early on, before I was actually at school, like
Uh,
in kindergarten. And I think everything starts to shift when I think back to those very,
I
very
think you're
early
spot on,
formative
and let me tell
years.
you why. I believe over the last probably what 400 or 500 years, the world has had what I'll call formal classical education, right? If we go back to Europe and all of these great schools that were rooted in philosophers from ages before that, but when we got formalized advanced education, it began this quest for the recollection of knowledge. And when one was to one was able to carry more knowledge, they were rewarded. Even at the very early years, if you or I were to raise our hands to answer a question and we got it right, we were rewarded. If we got it wrong, I don't know about you, but I stopped raising my hands because it became the natural tendency
Mhm.
of the rest of the classmates to giggle. Oh, Stevie or Susie or whoever got it wrong, right? But today, if we reflect back on that, we've created generations that are far more interested in being right than being happy. And we've stopped rewarding curious
Mhm.
questions and only rewarded correct answers. That takes away imagination, curiosity at a very formative age. And if you think about curiosity, I just finished a book called The Art of the Impossible, a wonderful book by Stephen Kotler. And in it, he talks about how the neurotransmitter dopamine, every time we're curious, it gives us a dopamine dump. And so I went and did some research on that. And of course, if we're talking about the world of happiness and mental health, one of the things we always have to talk about is the fact that people are constantly looking for that outside themselves, which of course brings up substance abuse issues. And if the classic one with dopamine is the use of cocaine, right? Yet in a study just recently, they said when I enact curiosity inside myself, I give like 2 to 3 times the same dopamine dump in my system naturally that I would artificially by doing like a line of cocaine. And why do I bring that up? Because people are always chasing something outside themselves for pure happiness. When if we wake up the state of play that exists in all of us, then we give ourselves an opportunity to use our natural sources within ourselves to have these wonderful feelings that so many of us are missing in our lives that lead us down these treacherous paths of depression and anger and addiction. And so, your point of feeling that death as a child, yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, and it's an accurate way to say that, like, the whole premise of this book was to help people wake up their playful self. I don't think we stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah.
It does. You said something that struck me. You said, we chase this feeling of imagination, happiness,
Hmm.
curiosity, play outside of ourselves, not realizing that we just need to
That's
wake
right.
up something that's already been within us. And I think, Steve, we don't know how to wake it up. And what I think happens is, or what needs to happen is that there's a great deal of
Hmm.
unlearning that must occur,
Hmm.
like deconditioning, deprogramming. And we just don't know how to do it because I think what happens is we grow up and we get big and
Hmm.
we just say, "Oh, this is just how I am." And then we can point to things in our life, these pivotal moments in our lives that shaped us in one way or another. And then we just accept that that's just how things are or how I am. And it takes, like, I believe, honestly, when I was reading your book, I was thinking to myself, this takes a deeper, this is to allow this. um, to allow adults, people in our 50s, 40s, and older, to reimagine and play again. I believe it's a conscious introspective journey that we must take to unlearn, whether it's the religious stuff or unburden our souls from the traumas of our early life, of our dysfunctional families, and you name it, all the
1000%
stuff in
agree.
between.
And I believe that the challenge for most of us is when we use the word play, the narrative generally goes to one of three places. It's the childlike behavior that's a behavioral science to help us through adolescence into adulthood. Two, it's the reward we give ourselves after a long week of work or a long year, and then it's vacation. Or three, it's the lifestyle of the ultra elite that most of us will never realize. Very few people see play as anything other than that. And yet, I like to tell people if you think about a lot of the really great traits of a conscious human being, somebody who's really active in making decisions in their life and not just deferring to the subconscious programming that we've been given over our years, those people probably find themselves with some element of discipline, some element of learning on a regular basis, exposure to growth, some element of community and being with other human beings in this process, which creates authenticity and transparency. And the list of these, what I'll call tools, exist. What's interesting about all of the aforementioned tools and a whole bunch of other modalities I could mention to help support consciousness is they're learned. I didn't wake up and say breath work changes my
Mm-hmm.
life. Somebody pointed me to that. I didn't wake up and say yoga and mindfulness
Mm-hmm.
will help my life. Somebody pointed me to that. But the only place, and I'm not the scientist, but my research, it feels pretty confident on this. The only behavior I never had to learn was play. Like, think about your children. I think about mine. Like nobody ever had to tell
Mm-hmm.
my son Hunter or my daughter Ansley, "Hey, you're just studying way too much. Go play." Right? It's like, wait a minute. You don't have to go to bed for another.
Right, right,
Right. You
right.
don't have to go to bed for another
You're
2 hours.
working too
What are you
hard.
doing
Yeah.
sleeping? Go play. It is when we talk about certain toys, like the batteries are
Mm-hmm.
included. Well, as a human being, the battery of play was already wired into who we are. We're curious beings by nature, and it is our culture and the loading up, if you will, of the subconscious, because when we're born, there's not really anything going on there. It's through, I believe it's called theta wave state. The first 6, 7 years of our lives, we begin to load up our subconscious. But if we were to stop and think about the natural byproducts of play, it relaxes intensity, it brings me fully present, it makes me socially open and emotionally safe. It activates imagination. It reduces conflict. I mean, the list of things. Yeah, it's just like it's like this.
It
If
goes
we're
on and
talking in
on.
terms of like what's
Mm-hmm.
the best vitamin I could take for the physical body, well, for the conscious body, the psyche, right? Man, we should be taking huge doses of play on a regular basis. And excuse me, I believe that sometimes people think that means I'm advocating for recess all day, and I'm not. What I'm advocating for is a mentality, not a modality. Does that make sense?
It does. So I think what you're saying to us is not only do we need to unlearn all that programming that we got, that we have to grow up and be mature and be responsible, and we're not a child, you're a grown up. So, be a grown up. Is that we also have
Yes,
to broaden our
very much
definition of
so.
what it means to play. And you used a great example in your book. You give a lot of examples of, what play could look like.
I mean, play is Play is
Yeah.
whatever that thing is. And you may recall that I give kind of a classic definition of play, Webster's version. We talk about a clinical definition of play, what all these
Mhm.
scientists are saying
Mhm.
it is. And then I just give a real simple version. And I generally believe that play is anything where I'm doing it for the sake of nothing, right? There's no additional intention. It brings me fully present.
Mhm.
It activates my imagination. It has me emotionally safe and like willing to be connected with others. Now, ask ourselves if I can have those five tenets in my
Mhm.
life,
Mhm.
from working in a wood shop, from, being in a kitchen, from going on a hike, to actually, like, in my world, I have what I call a little play altar, which are in large part many things from early years of life, but they stimulate the freedom that comes from remembering childlike silliness, right? And so it's different for everyone, but when we give each other
Mhm.
permission
Mhm.
to be playful, if all humans were the majority of time possessing those five prior tenets I just mentioned, my goodness, the world would be a much better place. And then when we begin to understand play is for play's sake alone, how much more valuable can it be when we play with purpose to offset what you talked about earlier, the conditioning of the human mind and all the stress and guilt and anxiety that builds up in a human because they don't otherwise have what I'll call release valves to manage that stuff.
Right. I think it's so much easier said than done, and this is something that I've observed in my cohort of people. I'm 50 years old, and the people that are grown up, and I have a 12-year-old,
Hmm.
but some of my peers have adult children. And when I am what I've learned is when I ask my peers about dreaming, like what do they dream about, or what would they do if money wasn't, an issue, or if they could do whatever they wanted.
Yes,
A lot of people don't know like they draw blank, like they have
absolutely.
forgotten how to dream, like they don't even have any
Hmm.
dreams anymore. And I think that is frightening. And I remember saying at one point that if I couldn't dream or imagine or create, or I wouldn't wanna be here. Like, that would be so painful to
Yeah,
be just
it's
closed off to that part of myself.
this
Patience.
is one of the number one byproducts of getting back onto the pathway of play is it opens up possibility thinking, and that's so critical today. And that's where imagination comes in. What if this? What if that? Right? And I love to tell people, I've got this little hashtag
Mhm.
in the IZ, and it stands for the imagination zone. Like, in a child's world, the only difference between what is perceived in their mind and what is real is physicality, because until we teach them limiting beliefs, like, if they don't have any. Hey, can we start a zoo, Dad? Sure.
Mhm, they don't
And
have
they're like,
any.
okay, let's get going, right? Can we go to the moon? Sure. Well, yeah. and
Mhm,
and this
mhm,
this
mhm.
idea of limitation is only what is handed to us by those who have gone before us. So, one of the things I really advocate for is waking up imagination, because in the book, I talk about one of the things that really excites me, which is the possibility that maybe someday in the future, we could have global peace. And people often say to me, "What, are you crazy?" And you may recall in the book, there's actually, over the last 3,400 years, I forget the exact number, I think it's 237 years, where we knew no global conflict within a country or amongst countries in the last 3,400 years. So, what I'm advocating for isn't even impossible by virtue of having done it already. And that's why I love it.
Mhm,
Constantly
mhm.
contemplates the things that others would never dream of. And if we do that more, then perhaps we can begin writing narratives and stories in our own consciousness about what my life could be like. I like to tell people my life is a curious collection of experiments gone wrong. And I say that in the sense that I have lots of wonderful things that I've
Mhm.
accomplished in my
Yeah.
life, but I'm also the product of a dysfunctional home. And by product, I don't mean victim, but like that was how I got spit out. The end result is my ability to value human relationship and how to interface left
Mhm.
me as a divorcee twice. Now I could create the narrative that I'm not lovable and I'm the problem, or I could
Mhm.
create the possibility thinking that because of my playfulness and my imagination and those experiences, I now have everything I need to orchestrate a wonderful love and connection with a human being that in my future I'm quite sure I'll manifest. But most of us don't go to that higher frequency. Most of us go to the lower frequency of I'm done, no one's going to love me, or whether it's money or
Mhm.
health or, making advancement in work. I mean, there's always a narrative. Play
Mhm.
helps rewrite the script with unlimited possibility.
Mhm. Yes, I often talk about this in my conscious work, the idea of what's motivating you. Are you working from a place of often fear
Yeah.
or habit, or your past
Hmm.
even? Or
And
are you working from a place of potentials and possibilities?
yeah, I think this is why I love even just the
Mhm.
title of your podcast, because
Mhm.
two words, very simple: be conscious. However, and you know this far better than I do with your doctoral background, but like I think experts tell us we actually live in the conscious state less than 5% of our waking time, and the rest of us is so genuinely generally automated by subconscious past. If you think about that, you know that's
That
to
explain why we're
take
so
some
unhappy.
time and simply
Yeah.
experiment with play, right? Like, you don't have to buy into the idea that, okay, overnight everything's going to change, but it does take a conscious effort to say, all right, how will I play? And I think sometimes people misunderstand my invocation. I'm not asking people to go back to their childhood, because for some of us, myself included, there's not a lot of really anchored memories there that are wonderful. I'm simply asking people to, that's
Mhm.
right. Yeah, I'm simply asking people to discover their playful
That you'd
self. And it comes out once in a while, right?
Right. Well, Steve, you come from a corporate background with a lot of experience, and there's a lot of compartmentalization of work and play in those environments, in those grown-up environments. When we come back from our break, let's talk about how can we let go. All right, stay tuned.
Like what you're hearing so far, make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. How would you describe your relationship with money? Did you ever imagine that your deepest feelings and beliefs about money could be preventing you from acquiring all the wealth that you desire? Click the link below in the show notes to learn more about Dr. Nicholas's highly sought-after Frequency of Money program to positively transform your relationship with money. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now, back to the show.
So before the break, Steve, we were talking about unlearning a lot of these messages and experiences, traumas, conditionings of the past that tell us to grow up and be serious and be responsible and leave childish things in childhood. Not just bringing it to our personal lives, like me as an individual, dancing in the shower and learning what it is, relearning to play and just be playful and figuring out what that is that brings that energy back, that imagination and dreaming back to you. But then if you take it one step further, or maybe 10 steps further, how do we do that in the workplace? Like, how do we get the C levels, the people that have been conditioned, often in different generations? They may be, more senior than us in many ways.
It's very vast, and you have to go back historically to understand, especially here in America, how we have been so rigidly shaped by the generation of before you and I, the baby boomers. You and I are both Gen Xers, and I look at the baby boomer generation, and they were born at the same time as America was booming in the industrial revolution. And why? Because we were spitting out all sorts of weaponry, and like we were saving the world, and so we had to find more efficient ways to create things quicker and better and faster. And when you look at from World War I to World War II, the only thing that mattered was like, what is the process by which we produce and manufacture stuff? And so it was all about process. And then if you fast forward to the 70s and 80s, I think it was
Mhm.
either Motorola or Intel. I think it was Motorola who came up with the idea of Six Sigma, which was this process by which, if we're going to make 1,000 processor chips, how do we make sure 1,000 of 1,000 are great, right? And that we don't lose production value. So we went from production to the actual
Mhm.
process to the product. And then of course the dot-com era was all about, now how do we really go into profits? And if you look at the last 2 decades, we have had, I think it's 14 straight years of a bull market, which is more than double the prior historical records, like this upward swing. So I like to tell people, for 70 years we focused on
Mhm.
process,
Mhm.
product, and profit. It's time to focus on people in the workplace. The numbers are dangerously alarming. Before we went on your show today, you and I visited a little bit about some statistics from 2021, and 9 out of 10 people in the workplace today say that the number one contributing factor to their mental anxiety, dis-ease, or all out mental unhealthy state of being is the workplace. And so my real plea with HR directors, with C-suite leaders, with middle managers, and leadership at higher levels, is to just be open to the idea of experimenting with play. And as we said before the break, I'm not asking for a 40-hour work week to throw in an hour of recess each day. I'm asking us to begin to explore what play really is, because I do this workshop called "You Want to Play a Game," and Susan, it's really simple, right? If we're going to play the game of opposites, right? And if I say up, people say down. If I say left, they say right, right? And you go on and on. And when you come to, if I say play, people say work. Well, this is where, when we get to the core of what play really is, work is not the opposite. The opposite of play
Mhm.
is resistance. And if you think about the big corporate
Mhm.
expression today, how do we increase employee engagement, right?
Mm.
That expression, employee engagement, has been used for the last 30 years. I've written white papers on it, I've read on it, I've heard, and I have never seen the
Ad
numbers be
nauseum. Yeah.
more than 80-20, 70-30 at best, meaning 70 to 80% of the workplace says they're either unengaged or disengaged, right? So if yet in with those glaring statistics, right? If that
Mhm.
remains true, and yet we have had one of the most bullish markets in the corporate world in history, what would happen if we actually said, let's pause a moment and actually turn that number on its head? Like, what if it was 80% were fully engaged in their work? There would be so much profit, it would be ridiculous. We could probably this is the challenge of the
Mhm.
world. We
Mhm.
have so
Mhm.
set ourselves up to believe that there's just a few
Right.
corporate individuals who get to make obscenely large amounts of money, and everybody else has to get by. But if we actually invested in people, and in the book I talk about, and they're not original ideas with me. I have to give Dr. Stuart Brown, the author of Play, that's the name of the book, Play. I have to give him credit. He kind of conjectured after years of study that we all have play personalities. And I give him credit in the book and allude to those. And I begin to play with the idea of what if we applied play personalities to the actual process of interviewing, attracting, and thereby hiring to the strength of a person's play personality. And let me illustrate what I mean. I'm a storyteller. I love to speak. I love to get people excited. I love to wake up emotions. Well, that is a type of play. Once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, right? That kind of concept. And if you think about that, who's perfect in the workforce for that
Mhm.
kind of role? Anyone in sales. They're telling a story, right? And then you have people who are directors or collectors and or jokers, right? And
Mhm.
understanding
Mhm.
how to match people to their natural states of
Mhm.
play in a professional environment will get so much more out of people. And of course, creating environments that are not
Right.
rigid, that are not so sterile in their nature that people can't be themselves. This, of course, I think is the
Mhm.
biggest challenge of the workplace is that I don't generally show up authentic or authentically. I show up in a
Mhm.
way that ensures that I have job security. But how much better would it be to set that environment? Yeah, so I could just, I'm bald, but like that, so I could let my hair down, right?
Right, right.
Figuratively speaking,
If you show up
and
as
so,
yourself. Mhm.
yeah, I think you're really onto something. Hmm.
But we're afraid of that, aren't we? Aren't we
There's no
afraid of
doubt.
that though? I mean, just as individuals, I always say we have a public self and a private self. And then we kinda, stuff ourselves into suits and other rigid clothing, uh, wear our
Well,
hair certain
we play a
ways,
part.
jewelry or lack thereof,
Yes.
fragrances or because we need to show up in a certain way to meet the expectation of a client or a public. But then in our private selves, we like wanna get all that stuff off and
Well, the sooner I get to be who I am, wherever I am, the sooner I'm more
yeah,
useful for
or
myself and
personas,
for
yep.
anyone who experiences me. The minute I have to be one person somewhere and another person in another place, the harder it is. In a recent survey, 3 out of 5 workers said they felt
Mhm.
sorely undersupported
Right.
by their management when it came to mental health. That's 60% of the workforce, which isn't surprising because it's consistent with the fact that 52% of all people in middle management roles have never had any training on management, nonetheless, any training on life skills of empathy and inquisition and listening and curiosity, right? Like we weren't taught to care about a person's
Mhm,
well-being in the
mhm, mhm,
workplace, which is today it's almost inconceivable because of how passionate people like yourself and myself are about people's well-being. But it's really true. I was recently consulting with a company about 2, 3 years ago on the West Coast, a tech startup. 4 brilliant young men, and two of them were at odds with the other two about something that was so, I guess, just sad to me, which was I don't want to get too close to my people because if I get too close to them, they may think we're friends and not work hard enough for me. And I thought, wow, that's just so it's useless. It's not going to get you really what you
mm,
want.
mm.
And yet this is
Right,
oftentimes the
backwards,
narrative
yeah, yeah.
of many, many workplace environments, right? There's the
Mhm,
us and the they, but it's not the we. And the sooner we get that narrative changed, the sooner we create
mhm,
a playground in the
mhm,
workplace where and it's so much needed today because we need to develop the skill of innovation in a world post pandemic, right? And I'm not even sure we're quote technically out of pandemic, but when we think past it, being innovative is important. Well, to be innovative, you've got to have improvisational skills and you've got to be able to access imagination. That means having a once a year planning meeting isn't going to cut it to get your company where you need to go. So, if you want skill sets like
mhm,
improvisational thinking, excuse me, to affect innovative behaviors, and ultimately all of that be fueled by highly imaginative employees, you sure as hell are going to have to add some play to the mix somehow.
Well, you
Hmm.
say in your book that human beings are a scientific design who have within themselves play as the essential operating system for all of living. I love that quote. And it brings me back to a thought that I had while you were speaking about the workplace. And I think, like, the tech companies in particular try to, I would say, engage play or try to bring out play. They might have ping pong tables or sliding boards or have hiking or retreats or working outdoors or standing desks to
Yes.
inspire that operating, like that essence of us. But what I think happens is if you, let's just say you're not in the tech industry. Let's, that where this is deliberate, to engage, to bring out that. What about if you're in I worked in a very rigid corporate structure at one point where it was absolutely against, like, you would be fired. Uh, like, it was a culture of fear, and if you let your hair down, or if you weren't just in line, or if you weren't dressed a certain way, or if you didn't show up this way, you would be fired. And so people were afraid of losing their jobs, and nobody was authentic in themselves. Nobody
I
was.
actually began this journey with PlayLab almost 10 years ago, and people thought I was crazy. But now, because of what's happened the last couple of years with the pandemic, people are now beginning to listen, and you're hitting the absolute core of the issue. It is a generational thing. And I will leave two particular companies, one of which, both Fortune 100, one of which I worked with pre pandemic for about 18 months, one of the most world's recognizable brands in athletics, and one that I actually have a meeting with later this week, that is one of the world's most recognizable brands within the beverage industry. Huge, like, companies with, like, long decades of history. And in both cases, I've asked one simple question: what is your plan to ensure mental health awareness amongst your leadership to serve your employee base in 2022 and beyond? And Susan, you could hear a pin drop at the other end of the line. And it's because the leaders of most of these companies are still very
Mhm.
baby boomer oriented thinking. A few years back, I wrote a white paper called The Millennial Shift. And in February of 2020, just prior to the pandemic, we had a
Mhm.
major economic shift. And it didn't get talked about a lot because the pandemic was coming. However, that was when the buying power of the millennial age group came became bigger than the buying power of the baby boomer. Now, of course, our generation just gets skipped and all that, but notwithstanding, that's because the millennial phenomena is not a U.S. based phenomena; it's a global phenomena. And that is putting enormous pressure today on leadership to begin to ask the question, like, I need to become bilingual. Like,
Mhm.
I need to learn how to
Mhm.
talk my thinking, but more importantly, I need to learn the language of this generation that is demanding a conscious community, safe, emotional space to work, which, to the point you made when you asked this question initially, those were things never contemplated 40 years ago. And yet a millennial will stay with you 6, 12 months tops, and if you don't create those things for that person, they and a whole bunch of others will go out and
Mhm.
create your competition. Like the decentralization of the mega corporation and the globalization of business to make, America not the only conversation anymore,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
creating, in my mind, one of the most opportunistic moments in humanity to, like, to and I'm not advocating for, don't do work and socialism and just let everybody take care of me, but for every human being to wake up and really believe they have an opportunity for freedom in every sense to pursue life, liberty, and the practice of happiness, that that premise is coming upon us because millennials are saying, if the workplace isn't different, we're leaving the workplace. So yeah, it's time for HR people, for C-suite leaders to see that mental health in the workplace is not optional. It's like it's a moral mandate to say, we have to own responsibility for this. Years ago, it was the old, hey, what are we doing to deal with sexual harassment, right? Which, of course, still needs to be addressed. But to leave it there is to stop woefully short. Like, if I'm the CEO of a company today, I and I am, right, of my own, but it's small today. It's me and just my two partners. But like, if in our future pacing we have 1,000 people or 100 people or whatever we have,
Mhm. Mhm.
my mandate is to ensure that those are the happiest people on the planet. And when I do that, I'll get everything I need out of them from a work or productivity perspective. And so it's time to change that narrative. And it's slowly and then it's suddenly. And I believe we're in that slow pace now, but I also am very optimistic that in the next few years we're going to see some of the world's largest brands say, okay, it's
Mhm.
time. Somebody's got to step out there and be the leader and say, we are changing the narrative on mental health in the workplace. And I hope that Play Lab and our book will be right there in the mix of all of it. Being like fire starters, conversation starters, catalytic in people's thinking, because um, that's my dream, to make a difference through play.
Well, Steve, we're getting to the end of the hour, and I wanted you to help us with like make a
Hmm.
conscious kind of effort or thought in one of the areas of your book where you kind of talk about archetypes of the mind. I'm just going to say them briefly because I want you to touch on one of them, one area, like how to make the leap
Yeah.
that I think is that we're kind of going around, going around, going around, but really, how do we do it? So you talk about Gary the
Yeah.
gatekeeper, this unconscious croc brain, this amygdala, like we don't really have control over it. It always tells us no or to avoid things that are different or new. And then you called it Betty the blueprinter, establishing patterns and kind of getting done with the day to day. Those are all very useful, whatever. And then there's this is where my experiences has been the most challenging. You call this Adam the achiever, like getting it done, and I would squarely fit myself into that bucket for most of my life, just like task, 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 task. I still find myself, you know, fighting Adam the achiever to get more and more done, be more and more productive. And then you have this Mandy the magician, this magical, this idea, place of imagination of ideas, this super consciousness, you call it.
Yeah. Great
So,
question.
how does one come from the achiever, the getting it done,
Sure.
to the super conscious? Like,
I'm in what we call the prefrontal cortex. I'm in the part of the brain that's action oriented. I might be a list person, or I might have a rich attention to the detail of time management. Right? We might see my schedule, as we say, time blocked. Right? But like,
mhm,
there's a bit of rigidity that comes with that because it's go 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 go. The premise of
mhm,
Mandy the Magician, where the magic happens, and I always like to tell people, literally think of a magic show, right? Like, one of the
mhm,
biggest expressions that comes out of any magic show is, how did she do that, or how did he do that, right? Like, there's wonderment behind it. And earlier in the show we talked a little bit about the use of imagination. Imagination is not simply a force
mhm,
to
mhm,
create conceptually, it's a force that engages emotion, because we do far more because of how we feel than what we think. So if we think that we're human beings, not human doings, not human havings, right? Then we got to get the being right. And the being part includes taking
mhm.
time to simply contemplate. I think about Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn sitting under a tree with a reed
Right.
of grass in their mouth, right? And just daydreaming. Like, what would the world look like if all of us gave 10 minutes a day to the daydreaming process, or maybe it took longer, maybe it took less, but we gave it to the point where we could feel something. So much of society has suppressed emotion. The key to getting from achievement to magician is emotions. And the more we
Mhm.
understand the full range of emotions, and we don't treat this in the book, but it's something we talk about a lot in the work we do with people, is play activates the highest sense of emotion, which is, peace, joy, gratitude, love, giving, right? Whereas other aspects of emotion like frustration, anger, sadness, depression, numbness. These things come out through other behaviors. So, the way we're going to get to that magician is begin experimenting, like stepping outside of our normal set of behaviors. If I'm used to doing A, B, C, and D every day the same way, maybe I pull D out, I add F and G, and maybe I start with G, F, and then go C, B, A, right? Like mix it up in your life. The more we move away from what's predictable and into experimentation mode, the more likely we are to find the magic. Now, that in and of itself takes some achievement oriented thinking, right? Because I've got to consciously say, okay, I'm going to do it different.
There's a process of it. Mhm. You know, I wanna close this by saying, I think we have to trust ourselves. So as if I'm the owner of my business, if I'm the manager, somewhere in between, if I am a worker in the business, I think we all have to trust ourselves, meaning that there's not judgment for being myself. I'm not gonna be judged for that. And that as the owner, the manager, I trust that my employees, it's not gonna be like out of line or just not representing my brand or whatever, that allowing my workforce to be themselves is inherently good.
If you will trust the process whereby we begin to shift the behavior of the employee, shift the energy level of the employee,
Mhm.
then the outcome will absolutely follow. But you got to be willing to trust the process. Now, exciting for us is we just recently have kind of affiliated with a company called Maximize that
Okay.
gamification to help us measure mental health in the workplace and its correlation to productivity, to efficiency, to creativity. And over the next 3 to 6 months, we're excited about introducing some actual tools to support that. But even with those tools, people still have to do what you said, create judgment free zones where they allow the mundane to be replaced with the ridiculous, that they allow laughter where they used to want to give introspective judgment, right? And by doing this, you know, here's the best way I can say it. I
Mhm.
would never ever
Mhm.
bet against play. It always produces something useful. You just have to know how to look for it and then how to energetically manage what comes from it in a way to be productive for whom you are, or where you are, and the collection of people you're with. And yeah, you can always bet on play.
Wonderful. Steve, I'll have all of your information in the show notes and all the links to click on to reach you and your website. And I want to thank everyone for taking this inner journey with us today. And whether you are coming or going, looking inside or out, remember to be conscious. Now, if you love this episode and if today's message resonated with you, please subscribe, rate, and review the Be Conscious podcast. I want to know what inspired you and what conscious topics you would like to hear more about. And if you want, you can share those thoughts with me at info@susannicholas.org.
Thanks for listening to the Be Conscious podcast with author, TEDx international speaker, and conscious coach, Dr. Susan Nicholas. Be sure to connect with her to stay up to date with her latest news and works. Learn more about her conscious speaking platform at susannicholas.org/speaking. Stay tuned for the next thought-provoking episode. And whether you are coming or going, looking inside or out, remember to be conscious.